UN is warning South Sudan is on the brink of widespread conflict. As reports emerge, the Vice President, Riek Machar, has been arrested. A statement from his political party says a convoy of heavily armed vehicles carrying the Defence Minister and Chief of National Security entered his residence in Juba. Machar was arrested on unknown charges. The party calls it unconstitutional and a breach of a 2018 peace deal. Let's take a look at some of the main events in South Sudan's recent history. It became the world's newest nation after voting for independence from Sudan in a 2011 referendum. But violence would quickly overshadow the hard-won freedom. In 2013, a political dispute between the president and his vice president led to civil war, displacing millions by 2015. By 2016, attempts at a peace deal collapsed, leading to renewed conflict and famine. And since 2018, a fragile peace agreement has held, but violence and hunger have continued. And since 2022, South Sudan has struggled with floods, economic decline and political tensions, leaving millions in need of urgent aid. All right, let's look at this in more detail with Joshua Craze, who's a researcher and conflict analyst who's set to publish a report on the extremely fragile political state of South Sudan. He joins us from New York City. A warm welcome to Al Jazeera. So, as I mentioned there, the details surrounding Vice President Machar's arrests are thin on the ground. We're talking about a convoy of what we understand to have been 20 heavily armed vehicles entering Machar's residence and arresting him. The Minister of Defence and Chief of National Security have been implicated by Machar loyalists. But do we know what charges or accusations he faces?
Thanks, Neve. So the proximate cause for Machar's arrest was that he wrote a letter recently decrying the fact that the SSPDF, the South Sudanese army, is bombing civilians and has introduced the Ugandan army into South Sudan, where it's also participating in both bombing civilians and attacking opposition positions around the country. And both of those things, as Machar's rightly pointed out, are in violation of the peace agreement.
The arrest of Machar follows also the reported arrest of more than 20 of Machar's political and military allies. That's since February. Many, I understand, are being held incommunicado. Do we know where Machar or his allies are being held?
Well, Machar's still at home. He wasn't moved from his house. He was given a letter of house arrest by the Minister of Defence, Cholton Balok. Some of his allies are being held in Blue House, which is the National Security Detention Centre. Some of them have vanished and we don't know where they are.
What do you understand to have been the consequences or the reasons why we're now seeing this apparent gradual unravelling of the power-sharing deal between President Kiir and the first Vice President?
So I think we have to remember that in 2018, the peace agreement was a negotiated surrender between an opposition under Machar that had suffered a series of comprehensive defeats and Salva Kiir's regime. And since 2018, Kiir's regime has pressed home its advantage. It's forced the defection of dozens of opposition commanders. It's appointed its own politicians to positions guaranteed to the opposition under the terms of the peace agreement. It's recruited division-sized forces in violation of the peace agreement. And most egregiously, every year, it has committed military campaigns against the opposition and civilians that have used egregious sexual violence to displace tens of thousands of people. And what we're seeing right now, to be honest, is simply a continuity of what's been going on since 2018. So in December 2024, the South Sudanese army launched 3 different military offensives against the opposition. In one of those, in Nasser, it lost. And it lost not to the IO, the opposition, it lost to self-defense forces that came together to protect themselves against yet another violent encroachment from the government. And Salva, the president, took the opportunity to turn this humiliation into a way to continue to press his advantage against Machar. So he blamed Machar for what happened in Nasser, even though Machar honestly had nothing to do with it. He arrested scores of politicians. He has carried out massive bombing campaigns against civilians. And he's detained dozens of ministers. This is the peace agreement. The peace agreement has been a means for Salva Kiir to humiliate Machar, destroy the opposition, and instill himself really as a dictator in South Sudan.
What you describe sounds like a rapidly accelerating power grab. I mean, the UN is describing the arrest of Machar as leaving the country on the brink of widespread conflict. I mean, what sort of armed support does Machar command? And what, in your opinion, do these latest developments mean for overall stability in South Sudan?
So Mashar's forces have been weakened by defections and by a wholesale loss of support for Machar since 2018. He does command forces in Equatoria, in Unity and Upper Nile, and those already have been sites of clashes over the last few days, both in Equatoria and in Upper Nile, and I expect those clashes to continue, principally because the South Sudanese army is now leading ground offensives against whatever remains of the opposition. Paradoxically, I think those campaigns and the arrest of Machar might serve to undermine Salva, because they're going to retrench support for Machar, who's been very embattled thus far because of his helplessness in Juba. I think what we'll see around the country is a further spiraling of violence, as a lot of those conflicts have reignited deep ethnic divisions around the country, and we're going to see those continue to spiral. But as I said, this isn't something that's a sudden new development. This has been going on under the watch of the UN since 2018.
Where do you then see the failings on behalf of the United Nations, given that it is in their keen interest, of course, to ensure stability in the region, given that the UN are also warning that any breach of the 2018 peace deal will, quote, not only devastate South Sudan, but affect the entire region?
The UN has overseen literally over 100 breaches of the peace agreement. And yet just a couple of days ago, the head of the UN mission in South Sudan met with Bol Mel, one of the vice presidents and one of Salva Kiir's main supporters, and congratulated him for the upkeeping of the peace agreement, which is risible. What the UN should do is carry out what it has, which is the most expansive protection of civilians mandate in UN peacekeeping history. And yet since the beginning of this conflict in December 2024, the UN has not protected a single civilian, and hundreds have died. And so the people of South Sudan, who are hungry, in need of humanitarian assistance and tired, they do not want this war, are looking to the UN and asking, will you help? And rather than getting any help, they're being barrel bombed by the Ugandans and Salva Kiir's regime.
All right, Joshua Craze, good to have you on Al Jazeera. Many thanks for walking us through this developing story in South Sudan.
Thank you very much.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.